Chapter 13. William Makes a Night of It. William had disliked Mr. Bennison from the moment he appeared, although Mr. Bennison treated him with most conscientious kindness. William disliked the way Mr. Bennison's hair grew, the way his teeth grew, and the way his ears grew, and he disliked most of all his agreeable manner to William himself. He was not used to agreeable manners from adults, and he distrusted them. Mr. Bennison was a bachelor and wrote books on the training of children. He believed that children should be led, not driven, that their little hearts should be won by kindness, that their innocent curiosity should always be promptly satisfied. He believed that children trailed clouds of glory. He knew very few. He certainly did not know William. Mr. Bennison had met Ethel, William's sister, while she was staying with an aunt. Ethel possessed blue eyes and a riot of auburn hair, of which William was ashamed. He considered that red hair was quite inconsistent with beauty. He found that most young men who met Ethel did not share that opinion. Although Mr. Bennison had reached the mature age of 40, without having found any passion to supersede his passion for educational theories, he experienced a distinct quickening of his middle-aged heart at the sight of Ethel with her forget-me-not eyes and copper locks. William never could understand what men saw in Ethel. William considered her interfering and bad-tempered and stingy, and everything that an ideal sister should not be. Yet there was no doubt that adult males saw something in her, and William had the wisdom to make capital out of this distorted idea of beauty whenever he could. William was in that state of bankruptcy which occurred regularly in the middle of each week. He was never given enough pocket money to last from Saturday to Saturday. That was one of his great grievances against life, and just now there were some pressing calls on his purse. It was Ginger, William's boon companion, who had seen the tops in the shop window and realized suddenly that the top season was upon them once more. The next day, almost the whole school was equipped with tops. Only William and Ginger seemed topless. To William, a born leader, the position was intolerable. It was Wednesday. The thought of waiting till Saturday was not for one moment to be entertained. Money must somehow or other be raised in the interval. Tops of a kind could be bought for sixpence, but the really superior tops, the ones which befitted the age and dignity of William and Ginger, cost 1 shilling, and William and Ginger, never daunted by difficulties, determined to raise the sum by the next day. "We must get 1 shilling each," said William, with his expression of grim and fixed determination, "and we'll buy 'em tomorrow." "Well, you know what my folks are like," said Ginger despondently. "You know what it's like trying to get money out of 'em. Save your pocket money, they say. If they give me enough, I'd be able to say. What's sixpence? Could anyone save sixpence? It's gone in a day. Sixpence is, and they say save," he ended bitterly. "Well," said William, "all I can say is that no one's folks can be stingier than mine, and that if I can get 1 shilling—" "Yes, but you've not got it yet, have you?" taunted Ginger. "No," said William confidently, "but you wait till tomorrow." William had spoken confidently, but he felt far from confident. He knew by experience the difficulty of extorting money from his family. He had tried pathos, resentment, indignation, pleading, and all had failed on every occasion. He was generally obliged to have recourse to finesse. He only hoped that on this occasion fate would provide circumstances on which he could exercise his finesse. He entered the drawing-room, and it was then that he first saw Mr. Bennison. It was then that he took a violent and definite dislike to Mr. Bennison, yet he had a wild hope that he might be a profitable source of tips. With a mental vision of the tops before his eyes, he assumed an expression of virtue and innocence. "So this," said Mr. Bennison with a genial smile, "is the little brother." William's expression of virtue melted into a scowl. William was 11 years old. He objected to being called a little anything. I heard there was a little brother," went on the visitor, perpetrating the supreme mistake of laying his hand upon William's tousled head. "Will is the name, is it not? Willie for short, I presume? Mrs. Brown, noting fearfully the expression upon her son's face, interposed. "We call him William," she said, rather hastily. "I call him Willie, for short," smiled Mr. Bennison, patting William's unruly locks. Mr. Bennison labored under the delusion that he got on with children. It was well for his peace of mind that William's face was at that moment hidden from him. It was only the thoughts of the top which might be the outcome of all that made William endure the indignity. "And I've brought a present for Willie for short," went on Mr. Bennison humorously. William's heart rose. It might be a top. It might be something he could exchange for a top. Best of all, it might be money. But Mr. Bennison took a book out of his pocket and handed it to William. The book was called A Child's Encyclopedia of Knowledge. Mrs. Brown, who could see William's face, went rather pale. "Say thank you, William, dear," she said nervously, then hastily covering William's murmured thanks. "How very kind of you, Mr. Bennison, how very kind. He'll be most interested. I'm sure he will, won't you, William, dear? I'm sure he will." William freed himself from Mr. Bennison's hand and went towards the door. "You will remember," went on Mr. Bennison pleasantly, "that in my early training of the young I lay down the rule that every present given to a child should tend to his or her mental development. I do not believe in giving a child presents of money before he or she is 16. No really wise faculty of choice is developed before then. I expect you remember that in My Parents' Help I said—" William crept quietly from the room. He went first of all to Ethel's bedroom. She was reading a novel in an armchair. "Go away," she said to William. In the midst of his preoccupation, William found time to wonder again what people saw in her. Well, if they only knew her as well as he did. But the all-important question was the question of tops. "Ethel," he said in a tone of brotherly sweetness and Christian forgiveness, "have you got any tops left? You must have had tops when you were young. I wonder if you'd like to give 'em to me, if you've got any left, and I'll use 'em up for you." "Well, I've not," snapped Ethel, "so go away." William turned to the door, then turned back as if struck by a sudden thought. "Do you remember, Ethel," he said, "that I took a spider out of your hair for you last summer? I wondered if you'd care to lend me a shilling just till my next pocket money." "You put it in my hair first," said Ethel indignantly, "and I jolly well won't, and I wish you'd go away." William looked at her coldly. "How people can say you're attractive," he said. "Well, all I can say is wait till they know you. And that man downstairs coming just because of you, and worrying folks' lives out, and stroking their heads, and giving 'em books, well, you'd think he'd be ashamed, and you'd think you'd be ashamed too." Ethel had flushed. "You needn't think I want him," she said. "I should think I'm the only person who can grumble about him being here. I have to stay up here all the afternoon just because I can't bear the nonsense he talks when I'm down." "How long's he staying?" said William. "Oh, a week," said Ethel viciously. "He said he was motoring in the neighborhood, and Mother asked him to stay a week. She likes him. He's got 3 cars and a lot of money, and he can talk the hind leg off a donkey, and she likes him. All I can say," bitterly, "is that I'm going to have a nice week." "What about a shilling?" said William, returning to the more important subject. "Look here, if you lend me a shilling now, I'll give you a shilling and a penny when I get my pocket money on Saturday. I'll not forget. A shilling and a penny for a shilling. I should think you'd call it a bargain." "Well, I wouldn't," said Ethel, "and I wish you'd go away. Away!" "I don't call you very generous, Ethel," said William loftily. "No, and I'm not likely to be generous or feel generous with that man in the house," said Ethel. William was silent. He was silent for quite a long time. William's silences generally meant something. "Suppose," he said at last, "suppose he went to-morrow, would you feel generous then?" "I would," said Ethel recklessly. "I'd feel it quite up to 2 shillings in that case. But he won't go. Don't you think it. And will you go away?" William went, rather to her surprise, without demur. He walked very slowly downstairs. His brow was knit in thought. Mr. Bennison was still talking to Mrs. Brown in the drawing-room. "Oh, yes, that is one of my very firmest tenets. I have laid stress on that in all my books. The child's curiosity must always be appeased. No matter at what awkward time the child propounds the question, he or she must be answered courteously and fully. Curiosity must be appeased the moment it appears. If a child came to me in the middle of the night for knowledge—" He laughed uproariously at his joke. "I trust I should give it the best of my ability, fully and—as I said—here is our little Willie for short." Still holding his child's encyclopedia of knowledge, William turned and quickly left the room. Mr. Bennison had had a good dinner and a pleasant talk with Ethel before he came to bed. The talk had been chiefly on his side, but he preferred it that way. He was thinking how pleasant would be a life in which he could talk continuously to Ethel, while he looked at her blue eyes and auburn hair. He wrote a chapter of his new book, heading it "Common Mistakes in the Treatment of Children." He insisted in that chapter that children should be treated with reverence and respect. He laid down his favorite rule: a child's curiosity must be immediately satisfied when and where it appears, irrespective of inconvenience to the adult. Then he got into bed. The bed was warm and comfortable, and he was drifting blissfully into a dreamless sleep when the door opened and William, clad in pajamas and carrying the child's encyclopedia of knowledge, appeared. "Excuse me disturbing you," said William politely, "but it says in this book what you kindly gave me something about Socrates." William pronounced it in 2 syllables, Socrates. "And I thought perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining to me what they are. I don't know what Socrates are." Mr. Bennison was on the whole rather pleased. In all his books he had insisted that if the child came for knowledge at midnight, the child's curiosity must be satisfied then and there, and he was glad of an opportunity of living up to his ideals. He dragged his mind back from the rosy mists of sleep and endeavored to satisfy William's thirst for knowledge. He talked long and earnestly about Socrates, his life and teaching, and his place in history. William listened with an expressionless face. Whenever the other seemed inclined to draw his remarks to a close, William would gently interpose a question, which would set his eloquence going again at full flow. But Mr. Bennison's eyes began to droop, and his eloquence began to languish. He looked at his watch. It was 12:30. "I think that's all, my boy," he said, with quite a passable attempt at bluff, hearty kindness in his voice. "You haven't quite 'splained to me," began William. "I've told you all I know," said Mr. Bennison irritably. William, still clasping his book, went quietly from the room. Mr. Bennison turned over and began to go to sleep. It took a little time to get over the interruption, but soon a delicious drowsiness began to steal over him. Going. William entered the room again, still carrying his child's encyclopedia of knowledge. "It says in this book what you kindly gave me," he said earnestly, "all about compound interest, but I don't quite understand—" William was very clever at not understanding compound interest. He had an excellent repertoire of intelligent questions about compound interest. At school he could, for a consideration, play the mathematics master on compound interest for an entire lesson while his friends amused themselves in their own way in the desks behind. Mr. Bennison's eloquence was somewhat lacking in lucidity and inspiration this time, but he struggled gallantly to clear the mists of William's ignorance. At times the earnestness of William's expression touched him. At times he distrusted it. At no time did it suggest those clouds of glory that he liked to associate with children. By 1:30 he had talked about compound interest till he was hoarse. "I don't think there's anything else I can tell you," he said, with an air of irritation which he vainly endeavored to hide. "Oh, shut the door after you. It's very draughty when you leave it open. Oh, dear boy!" William, with the utmost docility, went out of the room. Mr. Bennison turned over and tried to go to sleep. It did not seem so easy to go to sleep this time. There's something about explaining compound interest to the young and ignorant that is very stimulating to the brain. He tried to count sheep, going through a stile, and they persisted in turning into the figures of a compound interest sum. He tried to call back the picture of domestic happiness with which the sight of William's sister had inspired him earlier in the evening, and always the vision of William's earnest, inscrutable countenance rose to spoil it. Sheep. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The door opened, and William appeared with the open book once more in his hand. "In this book, what you kindly gave me," he began, "it tells about the stars and the lion and that, and I can't find the lion from the window, though the stars are out. I wondered if you'd kindly let me look through yours." Sheep and stile vanished abruptly. After a short silence, pregnant with unspoken words, Mr. Bennison sat up in bed. He looked very weary as he stared at William, but he was doggedly determined to act up to his ideals. "I don't think you can see the lion from this side of the house, my boy," he said, in what he imagined was a kind tone of voice. "It must be right on the opposite side of the house." "Then we could see it from my window," said William brightly and guilelessly, "if you'll kindly come and help me find it." Mr. Bennison said nothing for a few seconds. He was counting 40 to himself. It was a proceeding to ensure self-control taught him by his mother in early youth. It had never failed him yet, though it nearly did on this occasion. Then he followed William across the landing to his room. William was not content with the lion. He insisted on finding all the other constellations mentioned in the book. At 2:30 Mr. Bennison staggered back to his bedroom. He did not go to bed at once. He took out the chapter he had written early in the evening and crossed out the words, "A child's curiosity must be immediately satisfied when and where it appears, irrespective of inconvenience to the adult." He decided to cut out all similar sentiments in the next editions of all his books. Then he got into bed. Sleep at last. Blissful, drowsy, soul-satisfying sleep. "Mr. Bennison, in this book what you kindly gave me, there's some kind of puzzles. 'Telligence tests, it calls 'em, and I can't do 'em. I wonder if you'd kindly help me." "Well, I won't," said Mr. Bennison. Go away, I tell you." "There's only a page of 'em," said William. "Go away," roared Mr. Bennison, drawing the clothes over his head. "I tell you I won't." William quietly went away. Now, Mr. Bennison was a conscientious man. Left alone in the silence of the night, all desire for sleep deserted him. He was horrified at his own depravity. He had deliberately broken his own rule. He had been false to his ideals. He had refused to satisfy the curiosity of the young when and where it appeared. A child had come to him for help in the middle of the night, and he had refused him or her. The child, moreover, might repeat the story. It might get about. People might hold it up against him. After wrestling with his conscience for half an hour, he arose and sought William in his room. At 4 o'clock he was still trying to solve the intelligence tests for William. William stood by, wearing that expression that Mr. Bennison was beginning to dislike intensely. At 4:15, Mr. Bennison, looking wild and disheveled, returned to his room. But he was a broken man. He struggled no longer against fate. 5 o'clock found him explaining to William exactly why Charles I had been put to death. 6 o'clock found him trying to fathom the meaning of plunger and inductance and slider and various other words that occurred in the chapter on wireless. It fortunately never occurred to him that they were all terms with which William was perfectly familiar. As he held his head and tried to think from what Greek or Latin words the terms might have been derived, He missed the flicker that occasionally upset the perfect repose of William's features. At 7 o'clock he felt really ill and went downstairs to try to find a whiskey and soda. It was not William's fault that he fell over the knitting on which Mrs. Brown had been engaged the evening before, and which had slipped from her chair onto the floor. His frenzied efforts to disentangle his feet entangled them still further. At last, with teeth bared in rage, and wearing the air of a Samson throwing off his enemies, he tore wildly at the wool, and scattering bits of this material and unravelled socks about him, he strode forward to the sideboard. He could not find a whiskey and soda. After upsetting a cruet in the sideboard cupboard, he went guiltily back to his bedroom. His bed looked tidier than he imagined he had left it, and very inviting. Perhaps he might get just half an hour's sleep before he got up. He flung himself onto the bed. His feet met with an unexpected resistance. Halfway down the bed, bringing his knees sharp up to his chin. The bed was wrong. The bed was all wrong. The bed was all very wrong. For a few seconds Mr. Bennison forgot the traditions of self-restraint and moderation of language on which he had been reared. William, standing in the doorway, listened with interest. "I hope you don't mind me trying if I could do it," he said. "I don't know why it's called an apple pie bed, do you? It doesn't say nothing about it in this book what you kindly gave me." Mr. Bennison flung himself upon William with a roar. William dodged lightly onto the landing. Mr. Bennison followed and collided heavily with a housemaid who was carrying a tray of early morning tea. William came down to breakfast. He entered the dining room slowly and cautiously. Only his father and mother were there. His mother was talking to his father. "He wouldn't even stay for breakfast," she was saying. "He said his letter called him back to town on most urgent business. I didn't like his manner at all." "Oh?" said her husband from behind his paper, without much interest. "No, I thought it rather ungracious, and he looked queer." "Oh?" said her husband, turning to the financial columns. "Yes, wild and hollow-eyed and that sort of thing. I've wondered since whether perhaps he takes drugs. One reads of such things, you know, and he certainly looked queer. I'm glad he's gone." William went up to Ethel's bedroom. Ethel was gloomily putting the finishing touches to her auburn hair. "He's gone, Ethel," he said in a conspiratorial whisper. "Gone for good." Ethel's countenance brightened. "Sure?" she said. "Sure," he said. "Now, what about that 2 shillings?" She looked at him with sudden suspicion. "Have you—" she began. "Me?" broke in William indignantly. "Why, I didn't know he'd gone till I got down to breakfast." "All right," said Ethel carelessly. "If he's really and truly gone, I'll give you half a crown." William, on his way to school, met Ginger at the end of the lane. "I've tried 'em all," said Ginger despondently, "and none of 'em will give me a penny." William, with a flourish, brought out his half a crown. "This'll do for both of us," he said, with a lordly air. "Crumbs!" said Ginger, with respect and admiration in his voice. "Who'd you get that out of?" "Well, a man came to stay at our house," began William. Ginger's respect and admiration vanished. "Oh, a visitor," he said disparagingly. "It's easy enough to get money out of a visitor." "If you think this was easy—" began William with deep feeling, and then stopped. It was a long story, and already retreating into the limbo of the past. He could not sully the golden present by a lengthy repetition of it. It had been jolly hard work while it lasted, but now it was over and done with. It belonged to the past. The present included a breathless run into the village, leaping backwards and forwards across the ditches, a race down the village streets, and tops! Glorious tops! Superior shilling each tops, with 6 pence over. He uttered his shrill, discordant war whoop. "Come on," he shouted, "for they're all sold out. Race you to the end of the road." Chapter 13